Okay, so this is very much a kind of brief presentation, and it's just to talk through some of the issues in how we approach the teaching of this topic. So the notion of investigating heritage crime, the different contexts within which we can run this type of training. Obviously, Elke's already touched on the way in which practical exercises are being run to deal with heritage stakeholders, whether that's internal museum protocols or working with kind of law enforcement agencies so that they have kind of training and almost muscle memory in place for when there are periods of increased kind of risk or threat to cultural heritage, for example, during periods of armed conflict. So we're going to talk through here the notion of defining the problem and then setting out the ways in which we've approached it within Cranfield. And the first thing here to really bear in mind is this notion of what are we actually talking about? And this is something that different institutions have different approaches to this, and usually it's born of what department they sit within. And this is something that has been quite a problem in trying to develop a sort of consistent or kind of widely accessible programs and guidance on these topics, is that understandably the author tends to set the tone for this. And so if you have a move that is focusing on archaeological heritage or even fine art, that tends to slightly skew both the terminology but also the approach that is actually taken in trying to develop syllabus for these kind of topics, but also in terms of how you would structure these programs and then market them. So with us at Cranfield, what we've deliberately tried to do is really focus on broadening the definition as much as possible. And one of the reasons for doing that is that we've attempted to move away from some of the language that can be quite problematic. I wouldn't say that we've mastered that yet, but it's something that we try and be more conscious about in our selection of the way that we're describing heritage or heritage material. But it's also because it has an impact on the way in which you can work with stakeholders, and particularly law enforcement, military or government agencies, to try and broaden their understanding of the way in which damage or threats to cultural heritage can really negatively impact on the communities associated with that cultural heritage, whether they're kind of using it in relation to intangible practice or the owners of that. So the notion of actually trying to understand what is an element of the victimization is really understanding what it is that they're under threat of losing. And so here we're dealing with both tangible and intangible elements. We're looking at what's known as movable and immovable tangible heritage as well. So we cover a variety of case studies and we work with stakeholders who are approaching this topic in relation to heritage sites, but also in relation to heritage artifacts. And again, whether we use words like fine art or antiquities or religious artifacts, for example, effectively you could categorize them within these terms. And again, it's not a perfect set of definitions, but we're kind of working off the way in which UNESCO has approached these conversations, so that there is some sort of reflection in the way that the law is written, but also understanding that there is a broader impact outside of traditional property rights when we're talking about cultural heritage. And so this then leads us on to actually trying to set the scene in terms of what do we mean by cultural heritage crime. And I think you've probably already in the last 3 presentations got an idea of this being an incredibly broad topic. Certainly the range of speakers, institutions and projects that you'll be hearing about over the course of the next 3 days really highlight that. So we're looking at criminal activity or kind of borderline criminal activity, as Peter talked about, with magnet fishing. Sometimes in certain contexts it's unlawful, other times it's more of a grey area. And so trying to navigate that with a view to developing training and programs that can help either the people who are supposed to be applying the law so that they have a better sense of when and how to do that, but also teaching people who may go on to work in academia or in policy roles to try and develop or even clarify the law. So we're looking at circumstances that are set within the kind of traditional peacetime contexts where you might be dealing with seemingly more straightforward criminal activity like theft or fraud. Vandalism would also fall within that. Often kind of more rural crime, you tend to be looking at things like arson and vandalism as one of the primary criminal activities under investigation. We've obviously already heard from Elke the notion of how armed conflict can impact significantly cultural heritage, putting it firmly in the crosshairs, but also opening up additional opportunities for criminal trafficking, theft, looting, etc., either directly by military agencies or kind of in that chaotic theatre of war arena. We're also looking at territories which are enduring some sort of period of political instability or violent unrest. And part of that is that, again, traditionally, some of the discussions surrounding these topics had sought to almost create a binary of in periods of armed conflict, in periods of peace. And unfortunately, the way in which armed conflict has itself evolved over the last really sort of 50 at least years, and also the impact of terrorist organizations and how that can cause significant instability even during a so-called period of peace. We've needed to obviously broaden our understanding of this topic, and so broaden understanding of when cultural heritage, both sites and artifacts, may be under threat, may be at risk. So I've put together here some images of this notion of kind of the different threats that can be faced here by cultural heritage, and I think the ones in the slightly darker blue, if that's coming up on your screen, are the ones that are probably most discussed or most well known. Again, they tend to garner significant media attention, but that can sometimes result in misunderstandings being put forward as the way things are. And this is something, when we were thinking about how to approach and kind of develop a pedagogy for teaching cultural heritage crime, we were really trying to deal with how do we maybe untangle or dismantle some of those assumptions or kind of misunderstandings that have stemmed from these topics. And so the notion of historic claims, I feel relatively confident in saying most of the time when that's discussed, it's in relation to losses endured during World War II, Nazi looted art or Holocaust spoliated art. And again, even then it tends to focus on kind of Western European collections, it tends to focus on fine art. There's less broad public awareness and kind of media coverage for some of the other elements of cultural heritage that were victimized during that campaign. But obviously also World War II was not the only conflict through which cultural heritage was either systematically targeted for destruction and for looting, as we're sadly seeing now. So again, the idea of approaching all of these topics in isolation of each other seemed to be perhaps something that had caused problems in the past and we were really keen to avoid. Similarly, the notion of fraud and kind of even theft seemed quite simple, but the market structures and the ways in which the art world operates actually can blur those lines as well. So, you know, when is a theft not a theft? Is it actually what's known as a title dispute? So you have different parties, all of whom think they own something or own a fraction of it, and how do you untangle that? Similarly, fraud is the legal basis for most criminal investigations or kind of incorrect labeling, kind of describing items in a civil context. But this is actually fakes and forgeries is the words and the terms that we're probably more familiar with in relation to authenticity disputes. So again, trying to kind of really unpick and identify where are the areas of risk and where are therefore the areas that people are looking for support and training to learn more about. So this really highlighted the need for a multidisciplinary approach. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of the speakers already have referenced that as well. And so I've just got as an example here, even if you think of the notion of due diligence, for example, this is a term many of us in the field are familiar with, that could be absolutely applied in terms of approach and understanding to investigation. You just call it investigation in one context, it's due diligence in another. But actually, if you look at the different elements that really you would look to be involving if you're conducting an investigation of a potentially problematic, potentially unlawful artifact, you're pulling on lots of different threads. So the notion of provenance research tends to be most discussed in relation to an art historical context, and understandably there's a lot of knowledge base there. Technical or forensic analysis tends to sit in more of a kind of arm's length scientific context. The notion of expert witnesses, again, you might have archaeological experts, you might have art historical experts, you might have criminologists commenting on things, or even legal practitioners. And so actually, again, understanding that in order to try and counter criminal activity in this area and equip people with the tools to really navigate these issues, there needs to be a really multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary approach to developing syllabus and pulling in that expertise so that people can grow their networks outside of an individual discipline. They have an understanding of how to gather evidence from these different disciplines and how to interpret that, because again, there is often a difference in the way in which archaeological evidence is understood and presented in comparison to, say, art historical or legal evidence. So the other thing that we kind of really started to realize was that there needs to be a constant contextualizing, and almost a constant recontextualizing of these discussions. And I think that's become particularly clear in the last 3 years, that actually, again, the idea of discussing any of these topics in a bubble isn't very helpful, but that it needs to plug into how each of those industries I just talked about, each of those disciplines are themselves evolving. So part of placing heritage crime and the teaching of investigation of heritage crime in context is looking at events that are currently happening. So obviously looking at particularly strong kind of transnational criminal networks or organized crime groups, looking at territories which are enduring periods of conflict or political unrest, looking at market buoyancy in relation to what types of artifacts, artists, or material is selling quite well, because criminals look at that data as well. So trying to actually monitor all of those things, and this means that the curricula potentially will need to change quite consistently to keep up to date. Obviously, in relation to things like legal frameworks, those can change significantly at both national and international levels. There have been big swings towards things like broadening impact of money laundering, or rather anti-money laundering regulations, and really refocusing them around industries, including the art market, in the last sort of 6-7 years. But also looking at the different types of technology and how that can impact and assist those who are working in this field to investigate cultural heritage crimes. So the landmark prosecution by the International Criminal Court in relation to the intentional destruction of sites in Mali, specifically Timbuktu, saw the development of new kind of technological solutions. For example, the platform that I've got a screenshot of here on the lower left, this was developed by Situ Research, and this was a tool developed to present evidence and information for the court to review that was really charting that destruction. So the use of satellite images, the use of photographs, the mapping of damage, and showing that this was deliberate damage, this was not collateral damage. So there's a kind of shift in not just the types of crimes that are prosecuted, whether it's at an international war crime level or an individual criminal prosecution, but also the different ways in which information can be converted or interpreted as evidence and then should be presented. And so this is another set of kind of evolving areas that practitioners working within the field of heritage crime, particularly governments, law enforcement, and legal practitioners, need to be familiar with and need to be keeping up to date with. There's also broader discussions around the notion of decolonizing both cultural heritage institutions. That was obviously just touched on in Jessica's presentation as well, but also the disciplines of archaeology and art history. And so I just got this image. This is from one of the Decolonize This Place protests. I think it was the 2018 protest. This was at the Brooklyn Museum, but actually asking for not that unusual questions here. How is this acquired, by whom, for whom? This is effectively investigation questions. These are provenance research questions. And so again, understanding that perhaps this notion of investigating where there is a contested element of ownership, whether that's deemed criminal or not, and we're obviously seeing a revisiting of colonial looting campaigns as well, is that that's also happening very much in front of the public's gaze. So the idea that we are under more of a spotlight and that there are broader implications to decisions that are made on either a case-by-case level or even a kind of criminal activity or conflict level as well. So this kind of really reinforced the idea of collaboration being key. And so, I mean, certainly from our experience at Cranfield, the MSc that was developed was designed very much in close collaboration and with direct input from different heritage stakeholders and industry practitioners. And this is something that, again, I think we've really realised needs to be constantly broadening. So simply having brought people in at the very beginning of the development of the course does not mean that you're therefore going to be useful and applicable going forward. So who those industry partners are should be constantly growing or possibly shifting. So the idea of working with other academic institutions, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of convert slightly the structuring of the Cultural Heritage Crime Conference this year to really include other institutions and to try and strengthen those collaborative networks, those opportunities for cross-country, cross-institutional exchange of knowledge and expertise here. But also, again, moving outside of the disciplinary kind of paradigms, so the notion of looking at who are the stakeholders or the claimants in relation to cultural heritage. Is that local community? Is that religious groups? Is that people who just kind of geographically closely located? Is that entire citizenship of a territory or of a country? Similarly, if we think of the notion of like legal professionals, exactly who we mean there. Do we mean lawyers and attorneys? Do we mean criminal prosecutors? Do we mean judges? And really with all of this, the idea is it should be everyone. If any of those elements are involved at some point in the investigation or the prosecution of heritage crime, they're voices who need to be heard, but they're also representing people who perhaps need additional support on these areas. It is quite a niche area, and so they're people who you could be working with to assist, as well as garnering expertise and insight from. Art market practitioners as well. So as we talked about the context here, the art market is, it exists, it is international, it has a significant impact in the way in which material is treated, valued and studied. It has a significant impact in the way in which and the reasons behind the formation of museum collections as well. So the idea of trying to ignore one side versus the other really seemed to be kind of falling apart and creating, again, a lot of opportunities for misunderstanding in relation to actually developing useful, practically applicable guidance for the investigation of heritage crime. But again, that's a broad area. The idea of art market practitioners there, you know, that's dealers, that's collectors, that's auctioneers, but it can also, like I say, be more for-profit museums. So trying to understand that there are different audiences that you need to be engaging, and there's perhaps different language and different approaches that you need to use to engage those audiences. Similarly, forensic investigators, there are some elements of crossover with scene securing and kind of basic analytical techniques, but the handling of an artifact is slightly different to the handling of another type of kind of material piece of evidence. So all of this needing something where you're bringing in those voices and you're working with those networks. So the idea here with trying to really discuss, and I'd love to hear other thoughts of people in the audience on this, was that we were seeking to really establish this notion of professional education. So people who were going to be going into practice doing this, but then grounding it in kind of real life lived experience. So one of the ways of doing that was really to actually bring in faculty such as myself and Peter, but also guest lecturers who work in these areas, who live this every day, who interact with these sites, who see these challenges, who work on these types of cases, so that we could bring in the idea of best practice, but also the experiences we've had of when things have gone wrong as well. And that enables the opportunity to really critically assess the risks and threats that cultural heritage face, try and balance that with the limitations that often you know, protective agencies may have in terms of limited resources, time, money, etc. Similarly, the notion of where you need an understanding of applicable national and international legal frameworks, and where you're moving into actually trying to become a legal academic or a lawyer, and that isn't perhaps what's needed, but you need to understand where are the red flags, where are the areas of risk, where are the elements for which you should be seeking to gather evidence in support of that particular element of the criminal activity that you're going to need to prove or potentially disprove. Examining the areas of criminal and civil liability. And again, this was something that the notion of actually teaching heritage crime investigation, it became quite clear that, again, there was a kind of grey area of when it was criminal, when it wasn't. And as we've seen from a lot of the discussions around illicit antiquities, but also kind of post-conflict treatment of looted or so-called conflict objects, a lot of those cases end up being resolved through the civil courts. So there needs to be guidance that kind of plugs in those two elements, that it's not there's one set of rules for one set of another, and the two sides never speak. This notion of gathering and evaluating evidence, that was also something that we really wanted to root in kind of in-field exercises, so there was an opportunity for people who are going through this training, much like Elke talked about, to physically interact with artifacts, physically work within heritage settings, which often have their own unique sets of constraints. And we've also, some of the assignments, the idea of developing the notion of gamekeeper turned poacher exercises. So with all of this knowledge that you're gaining, if you kind of flip that and think, okay, well then what would be the type of activity that you would actually move forward to do because you think you're more likely to get away with it? It's a really useful exercise to try and put yourself in the mind of the criminal, whether it's the forger or the thief, because that's an excellent way of highlighting where there are the gaps in security or gaps in perhaps the investigative approach that might mean people can slip through the net. So this notion of developing a kind of an organic follow-on for this approach, so that again there was a structure for teaching this topic. So really this is rooted in the idea of establishing some sort of consistent base level foundational knowledge, and that's again because a lot of the people working in this field, whether they're in law enforcement, military, they're students coming through from undergraduate backgrounds, they will have slightly different experiences, slightly different disciplinary strengths, and so you kind of need to bring together some sort of baseline which to start from. And so there's a lot of introducing kind of investigative techniques, forensic analytical methods, artifact handling. You sometimes have people who are really, really confident dealing with the site, but as soon as it comes to actually something quite kind of tangible, small and fragile, it's a whole different ballgame. So once you've got that setting kind of set up, you can then start to really almost unpick that information so much more critically, and we'd say sort of creatively examining how heritage crimes then take place within that industry. So that's where, again, the insight from practitioners is really, really key. That notion of us being able to bring in cases we've worked on and say, this is where something was missed and that was why, this is how something went wrong or why the dispute kind of evolved, so that you can then start to see what should have been done and develop that more kind of best practice policy. And then applying that in real contexts. So this is the notion of developing those in-field exercises that I'll talk a bit more about in a second. And then with all of that, once you've done that, actually working out how do you communicate. Because if this is professional education, you can't just sort of produce it all beautifully and then sit on it as knowledge. It's usually something that has to immediately be converted into, you know, evidence for a prosecution or information that be conveyed on a policy level to change or sort of shift approach to these issues. It might actually, best case scenario, even solve a problem or kind of tie up a gap in, you know, whether it's legislation or policy. So again, that notion of understanding all the different audiences you might need to be communicating to, the different styles of communication that you're going to need, and actually trying to embed that in the way in which these topics are taught, and there are opportunities for course participants to test and develop those skills. So some examples here of practical application of knowledge. These are just some images of kind of artifacts or scenarios that we've done the program at Cranfield. So the creation of mock crime scenes, but within actual museological or heritage settings. So you've got the idea of a museum break-in, if that happened while an institution was open, so specific things taken rather than everything. And so the notion of then recreating CCTV footage to try and then produce additional information that might inform interpretation of an MO. Similarly, upper right, we have the idea of unlawful metal detecting, which has potentially resulted in the looting or unlawful removal of archaeological material. Obviously, what you get left behind with is sort of a hole in the ground. So how do you then turn that into something that might allow you to recover the items and identify and prosecute the suspects or the criminals? Again, images of kind of vandalism on heritage sites, so notions of how you document that, what kind of criminal activity there could that be connected to, what kind of tools do law enforcement have to make arrests for kind of either antisocial behaviour or for damage to a heritage site. Obviously, artifacts themselves, if you're using some of the lab equipment and the analytical techniques, that could be linked to authenticity, where you're actually looking to either date or identify the key elements and aspects of an item, whether it's pigments, whether it's materials, or ultimately point you towards whether it is the hand of one artist or maker over another. One of our exercises we also ran this year in Italy, so this was an international, so the notion of kind of transnational threats and cross-border trafficking. And so again, looking at what are the different challenges in trying to secure or police heritage sites that are on a huge scale, or sites that are containing incredibly important, valuable material, but are by their very purpose open to the public and accessible spaces. So there's different obstacles there if you're trying to either protect those sites, but also if something goes wrong, how do you secure those sites? How do you search those sites for evidence? And what kinds of questions might you be asking in terms of, again, informing an MO, or ultimately looking to predict where those stolen items, if it is a theft, may end up moving through. And so the notion of grounding this through kind of knowledge exchange, but in real life scenarios, also offers an opportunity to then work with other entities. And so on this particular exercise, we were really lucky and grateful to be able to work with and learn from the American University of Rome, but also the Carabinieri and the Guardia di Finanza, as well as the OSCE, who you've already heard some discussion of. So trying to bring those entities together so we can learn from them, but also we can serve as additional training for those units as well. So this in turn just sort of forms the notion of syllabus development. So this obviously I've had to look specifically at our program. And so these are the ways in which we've actually come up with modules. So these have all been recently sort of restructured and renamed. But you can see there's this notion of this kind of knowledge imparting core content modules that set out what are the threats to cultural heritage, what do we mean by fakes and forgeries, what are the sorts of international criminal activities, so particularly in conflict scenarios that can occur against cultural heritage. And then those are really embedded through that practical application with these in the field exercises, looking at the types of tools that could be available to investigators. So that can be as seemingly basic as a camera, through to laser scanners and more kind of specific equipment that you might have on hand as a forensic practitioner. And then, like we just talked about with that battalion exercise, the notion of actually investigating these transnational threats in a foreign territory, where you have a different structure for law enforcement. Obviously, you have Carabinieri and Guardia di Finanza have a dual military law enforcement remit. So how does that impact? Who do you contact if something happens? How do you work with agencies from a different country or from a different structure? And again, how do you look to gather and share evidence if you're perhaps dealing with even an organised crime group that might be working across borders as well? And then there's the kind of more forensic setting, because our particular program sits within the Forensic Institute. So we've got introductions to things like basic evidence collection and investigation techniques, kind of analytical techniques and reasoning for forensic science. But also we quite uniquely have a module about courtroom skills. So the idea is that people coming through the program will be familiar with and have some knowledge of how to be an expert witness. So again, the idea of not just giving people the knowledge, but explaining how they may be asked to communicate that and the different means through which they can help kind of use that knowledge to try and counter these issues going forward. Similarly, the research project at Cranfield is also quite uniquely structured. You have the ability to write it in a kind of block like most traditional masters or kind of postgraduate programs, but you can also produce one or two papers that are geared towards a specific journal. So again, if you're looking at trying to convert the knowledge that you're producing into academic publications, you can literally do that and submit in that format through the research project. So the idea of communication being as important as the knowledge itself. The other thing is also the way in which these programs are structured. So again, I've had to draw on the way in which we do it at our institution, but there are other approaches. And so one of the things that Cranfield does is that this MSc sits within a modular master's program, and that gives participants the ability to choose master's modules from other programs. So if they're interested in explosive impact on structures, for example, if they are interested in practical archaeological excavation or forensic anthropology. So again, if you're dealing with situations where looted human remains may be part of the heritage artifacts that you're investigating, that can be incredibly important. So you allow exposure with people from the other disciplines, but also them to broaden their knowledge base in terms of that context. The Forensic Institute sits within Defence and Security, which is why we have the ability to look at explosives and ballistics as well. And there's significant investment recently, which was what enabled the actual purchase of a lot of this laboratory equipment. Working again with those external organisations. The other thing was also structuring the modules as week-long blocks, so that enables people within law enforcement or military or people who are working that can take a week off as almost a secondment from their work to come and take an entire module. And you can do that as part of the MSc, or you could do it as a short course, or even as part of an MRes or a PG cert. So the idea again of trying to work with people who are already in the industry and offering them something in a way that they can digest it, that they can potentially sell it to their employers, so that it's not a case of you have to necessarily take a huge amount of time off in order to get the support and the information that you need to continue working in your industry. So kind of concluding remarks here, the notion of developing these programs really needs to be done with industry input, and understanding that that industry input may well change significantly. You might have an approach that's advocated for 1 year is the complete opposite of the approach that's advocated for the next year, and that's because this industry is under close scrutiny at the moment, and you know, fresh perspectives are coming up on an almost daily basis. The notion of also delivering this through quite a consciously interdisciplinary approach and working collaboratively rather than competitively with each other, I think is something that is really key. Structuring it to offer opportunities for both knowledge exchange and kind of acquisition, but also bedding that in this practical application so that there's real kind of understanding of the context within which these crimes are investigated, the limitations on which the entities working on these issues are actually having to kind of come up against those challenges and how you can navigate those. Encouraging creative thinking and crucially critical analysis, again, always being able to learn from what you've done, where you've done it right, where you've done it wrong, and what others have similarly done right and done wrong, and being maybe less slightly precious about this. This is very much an emerging field as opposed to something that's kind of set in stone. And again, seeking to therefore expand the professional network for students, for the participants on these programs, but also through faculty and for faculty as well. So it doesn't have to, again, be a competitive thing of not wanting to share your contacts, it being something that actually can really benefit everybody. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm hoping I was